think that hello. Wow, the lighting is much better on this computer. This is Sarah's computer, as you can probably tell from the incredibly high quality lighting. The internet is still terrible because I'm still in my house, but the lighting is a huge improvement over my normal live stream setup. Okay, hi. Thank you first off for donating to this project. I want to give y'all some updates in the next half hour about where we are, what's going on with PIH Sierra Leone, ways that you can stay in touch, and just generally your thoughts on everything. So I'm going to start by talking about, so if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will answer some of those questions in the last like 10 minutes that we have together. I want to start by just giving you some really good news, because that's hard to find, but it's really good news. And if I were less discouraged by everything else, I would be so encouraged by this. Which is that as of today, the recurring donations coming in to PIH Sierra Leone, the people who are donating monthly, which I know is many of you, is now at $41,685 a month. There are two amazing things about this number. First, it is bigger than the number from April. So despite the fact that many people are under tremendous financial strain, the support for this project has gone up instead of going down, which is what we thought was going to happen, or what I thought was going to happen at least. So that is really wonderful news, and I am so grateful to everybody who has made a priority out of this project. And I know that our financial priorities for many of us are shifting right now, and I understand that, but prioritizing the needs of mothers and kids in Sierra Leone means a lot. So thank you. And the other thing about that number is that if you multiply it times 12, it is over $500,000. And with $500,000 a year coming into the matching fund, which I'll talk about in a second, and $500,000 a year in recurring donations that are being matched by that matching fund, we are at $1 million a year in sustained support. Now, the world is very different from what it was 3 months ago, and it's more difficult than ever, I think, to budget based on current trends, because who the frick knows what the world is going to look like 2 months from now. But that $1 million a year, if we can keep that up, that goes a very, very, very long way to making not just the Maternal Center of Excellence exist and dramatically reducing maternal mortality and all of the horrors that accompany it in Kono District and beyond. It also will help with the maintaining of that systemic strengthening, like a lot, because it's going to require ongoing support for many years, or several years at least. And so that is really encouraging, and I am so grateful to all of you. If you multiply, and again, this is a projection that I don't feel comfortable making, and I don't know how PIH calculates this stuff, but if you multiply that $1 million over the 5 years that we expect this project to take, that's $5 million. Hank and I are donating 6.5 over that period. We're hoping and expecting that there will be other sources of revenue from other business endeavors that we do, and that takes us a ways toward the goal that we need. Figuring out how exactly to account for all this, and how much of the money that isn't in the bank to count toward the building of the MCOE is something that PIH has to do. And I think it's shifting right now because, again, there's so much uncertainty, but that's the deal. That's where we are overall. So it's really exciting. Super, super grateful. Like, of the several things that have made me cry today, the one that made me cry from happiness was knowing that the total monthly donations went up in May. Another thing to tell you is that the matching fund is currently maxed out. So actually, like, current donations are not being matched because the matching fund is maxed out. It got maxed out as of like 2 or 3 days ago. So, which is good in some ways because it means that a lot of money is coming into the, so much money is coming in monthly that there isn't enough matching fund to match it. But if you are interested in making a $2,000 or more donation to the matching fund, let me know. sparksflyup@gmail.com. Of course, I know that almost all of you can't do that, and I totally understand and don't feel bad at all. But I have to ask. Also, if any of you are a billionaire and you can solve this problem quickly, also email me at sparksflyup@gmail.com. It's a very low percentage chance, but swing for the fences, green. Okay, so that's the financial update. Happy to answer more questions that you have about that. So a lot of people have been asking about COVID-19 in Sierra Leone. I really, really recommend listening to PIH Sierra Leone's audio updates. They are super helpful, and also you get to learn from some of the people whose work you're supporting, from the people who manage the laboratories, which are under tremendous strain right now. And supply chains are difficult for everyone, but they are really, really difficult right now in poor countries because most of the raw materials, like the reagenting materials that are used for testing, are going to rich countries because rich countries are paying more for them. And so there is the list of challenges is very long, but that's on the list. And you can learn from nurses, and you can learn from lots of and from physicians and lots of other people who are working, Sierra Leoneans who are working with PIH to strengthen the healthcare system and serve the needs of patients there. These audio updates, somebody will link to them in the sidebar, or in the comments, are so helpful to me. And it's a big part of how I follow what's going on with COVID-19 in Sierra Leone, but also a big part of how I follow everything else that's happening. So I really, really recommend it. It's super helpful. As far as coronavirus goes, though, very recently, I think in the last week, the first positive cases were seen in Kono at Koidu Government Hospital, the hospital where the Maternal Center of Excellence will be built. Oh, it's bad. 2 of the cases, I think, had no known contact with someone who had COVID-19 or even was suspected of having COVID-19, which means that there's likely community transmission in Kono, which means that contact tracing is hard, the same story that we have here. As a result of this, a lot of people who work at KGH had to go into quarantine. And as a result of that, the emergency department at the hospital is closed, and some other things as well for the time being. There are big challenges with this pandemic in a country like Sierra Leone. And one of the challenges that was discussed in the most recent podcast update is one that we experience here as well, which is that when the system gets strained, 2 bad things happen. One, people get scared to use the system, right? Like there becomes more doubt about whether, should I go to the hospital, right? We're seeing that in the United States with people saying, well, I have chest pain, but maybe I shouldn't go to the hospital because I really don't want to get COVID-19. And then there's also just the strain on the system itself because it's harder for the system to meet the needs of more people when they're sick. In a country where the system is extremely weak and fragile, that is exaggerated. So during the Ebola outbreak, one thing that several healthcare workers explained to me when I was in Sierra Leone is that during the Ebola outbreak, most people who died of Ebola did not die of Ebola. They died of malaria, or they died in childbirth, or they died of typhoid, or they died after a stroke, or they died of a heart attack because the healthcare system had shut down. In the United States, we've seen a certain amount of excess death associated with COVID-19 that's not caused by COVID-19, partly because people are scared of using the healthcare system, and partly because in a few cases, the healthcare system has become so strained that it's maybe become less effective at treating illness. That phenomenon is going to be dramatically exaggerated in poor countries, and we have not seen the worst of the pandemic in poor countries, and I am very worried about about my friends who work in poor countries, about people I know, and then about the communities more generally. I don't think that it would be honest to say that I'm not worried, and I think one of the things that's helpful about listening to the podcast is that you understand a little bit better. You get a little bit better of a glimpse of what it's like to have to make those really difficult decisions in really resource deprived, deeply impoverished communities. Yeah, so that's the basic update. I think that there are real concerns about COVID-19 and what its impact is going to be on the healthcare system generally in Kono, and what its impact is going to be on the Maternal Center of Excellence in particular. But look, because of this, more women are going to die in childbirth this year probably than did last year. Maternal mortality is it's still a huge problem, and in fact, it's becoming a bigger challenge in a lot of ways. And we're seeing a very stark example in rich countries as well as in impoverished countries of how failures of the system have catastrophic consequences for individuals. And in rich countries, it turned out that the systems that we thought of as being very strong, which are in many ways, really strong, especially comparatively, were built more for efficiency than resiliency. We didn't have a lot of extra hospital beds. We didn't have a lot of extra ventilator units. We weren't producing, tons of chemical reagents for the possibility that there might be a pandemic. We didn't have huge vaccine facilities that we kept running, even though there wasn't a need for them at that moment, or all kinds of things where we built the system to be as efficient as possible in a sort of capitalist model, but we did not build the system to be super resilient. Interestingly, we have built other systems to be very resilient, like our tank manufacturing system. Our military tank manufacturing system is very resilient. It produces a certain number of tanks every year, regardless of whether we need them, so that it can maintain the ability to produce a lot of tanks. We could have done that with PPE, and we could have done that with testing capacity and nasal swabs and lots of other things, and we didn't. And of course, there's a huge loss in that failure. But the moments of fragility that we feel or that are felt in some systems, some healthcare systems in rich countries, and it varies a lot from country to country, and then it varies a lot, of course, within a community. Because even if, the United States is ostensibly a very rich nation, but there are many healthcare systems within the United States that are not good and not strong. And so, and a lot of that inequality results from structural forms of injustice and structural forms of oppression. In some ways, infectious disease especially, but disease in general, is an expression of structural injustice. It's an expression of human I guess, failures of truly equal opportunity, equal access. And so we're going to see that most dramatically in the places that have been that have suffered the most from that structural injustice and that structural oppression over time. And for people living in West Africa, that's part of a several century history. So this is going to expose the weaknesses in weak healthcare systems around the world, and that's going to be true in Sierra Leone. And I really believe that making a stronger healthcare system that does a better job of serving vulnerable people is the best way, the best long-term way to minimize the cost and the unfairness and the injustice and the loss of life and the suffering that comes with infectious disease and that's accompanying this pandemic in particular. So that's kind of the update on where we are. And if you want to leave questions and comments, I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. I wish that things were going a little, I wish that I was more encouraged in general. But I will say I'm very encouraged by, as always, by the commitment of the people I work with. Also, I should say that since we last spoke, a bunch of nerdfighters got together and made a one-sheet for explaining what we're doing and what PIH Sierra Leone is doing with the Maternal Center of Excellence. And it's really great. And I think that'll be shared more widely in the coming days. Okay. Kath says, I didn't know about the COVID-19 podcast. What's it called? I think Hank's podcast is called COVID Sucks, People Don't, which is not the best name for a podcast, but he didn't ask me if I liked the name. And Claire wants the one sheet. Is that what it's called? Someone's laughing at that. Is that not what it's called? Maybe that's not what it's called. Yeah, so Emma asks, what am I doing to take care of myself? I'm okay, Emma. I feel a lot of clarity when I am working, and I need a sense of purpose to feel okay, and work helps with that a lot. But this, yeah, I mean, this is very hard. I think this is hard for everyone. I don't know a lot of people who are, for whom this is easy. And I am conscious of the fact that, we have a lot of support to help us get through. And we're doing okay. And thank you for being concerned. I do really enjoy taking a bath once a day, which is something I learned from PIH, from people. PIH put together a list, for those of you who don't know, of 10 mental health tips that were sort of guided by people who had experienced, for one reason or another, some form of quarantine or had experienced a pandemic in their community. And it was really helpful. And I still actually have it printed out and everything, and I use it all the time. Amelia says, the CARES Act lets people take a $300 charitable deduction on top of the standard deduction. Has there been any effort to advertise this? No, because I don't think I knew about that. So if you're a US taxpayer, you can donate $300 to charity and have that count as a deduction on top of your standard deduction, even if you don't itemize your deductions on your taxes. If none of that made sense to you, either you're not a US taxpayer or you're not a person who thinks a lot about taxes, which is okay, but ask your tax preparer or accountant or TurboTax or whatever about that, because that is an easy way to get the US government to subsidize your charitable giving. One of the things while we're on that topic, that drives me crazy about when rich people get stuff named after them. You know how like every time you walk into a building, it's named after a rich person? One of the things that drives me crazy about that is that all of those donations were subsidized by the government. Like basically the government subsidized each of those donations by usually by 38%. And so really it should be called the US federal government subsidized this donation Symphony Hall. It should not be called the Roy Disney Symphony Hall or whatever. That drives me absolutely crazy. It's one of the reasons that I never want anything named after us when we make charitable donations. And it's not because I'm like a good person who doesn't like public credit, which I'm obviously not. It's because I don't want to go to the bad place. As a small note, it's not super easy to donate to this campaign specifically via PIH Canada. There is a link, Sam, but it is not super easy. But if I give you the link, that might make it easier. What I should have done from the beginning was share both links all the time. But yeah, you can donate through PIH Canada and donate it at Canada. Sam says, my current dilemma is giving between PIH Sierra Leone and political campaigns in the US. I suspect PIH is probably the more cost-effective donation. How do you deal with that question yourself? That's a good question. I think PIH is more cost-effective, but I also think, I think it's much more, if you were thinking just in cost-effectiveness, I think it's much more cost-effective because I actually think it's pretty hard to move the needle with political donations. But that said, how much, putting aside all other political concerns, and imagining a world where there's only one political concern, and that is, does the U.S. meet its foreign aid obligations and its obligations to the World Health Organization, et cetera? That is a huge question, and it should impact the way every one of us votes if we care about this stuff, because the U.S. not funding the World Health Organization is a big, big problem. And in general, U.S. health aid and has been pretty, in some cases, very effective, especially around HIV treatment, but in many cases fairly effective. And it's also a lot of money. It's a tiny percentage of the US federal budget. I think it's either under 1% or under 2%. But it makes a big difference, and it's more money than much more money than any of us could raise individually. So I think that does matter a lot. I think holding especially Congress, actually, the president can talk a big game about this stuff, but Congress decides the budget. I think holding Congress accountable on that front is really important, and does make a big difference globally, a huge difference globally. When I travel around the world, and this is probably your experience, well, when I traveled, past tense, this is probably your experience too. I rarely meet people who don't think that the U.S. government is important to their lives. Regardless of where you live, the U.S. is just a very loud, in the best of times, neighbor. Yeah, so I do think that it matters. I think the question is, how do we effectively move the needle? And I think, or how do we, effectively bring about change? And for me, direct investment in impoverished healthcare systems is more effective to me right now. But I'm also not an expert in how to give. I'm not an expert in that stuff. Okay. Okay, I'm going to answer a few more questions. Sorry. And Haley says, right now I'm struggling with dealing with the horrible political situation on top of feeling a lot of despair about this pandemic and how little our government is helping. Yeah, I also feel a lot of despair about both those things. There's this idea in kind of classical history, 19th century history, cometh the hour, cometh the man, that like, you know, at the moment that history needs an Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln emerges. This pandemic really challenges that notion, which has always, of course, been problematic and wrongheaded. What is true, I think, is that that history makes us and history changes us. So when I am feeling less despair, Haley, I guess, is when I am thinking about the ways that human history has changed over the last 200 years or 400 years or 2,000 years, and the ways it might change over the next 20 or 50 or 100 years. I think about, you know, I think about the fact that we don't have to live in a world where 1 in 17 women in Sierra Leone die in childbirth. And we know that we don't have to live in that world because we used to live in a world where 1 in 17 women in many places died in childbirth. We don't have to live with this extent of injustice. We don't have to live with this extent of inequity. We choose this world. Like obviously we don't only choose it, right? Like we didn't choose, I mean, I guess in the broadest sense, humanity is responsible for COVID-19 existing in the first place. But what we are definitely responsible for is our response to COVID-19, which could have been different in ways that would have made it worse, and could have been different in ways that would have made it better. So like we choose it. Now, we don't choose it as individuals, obviously, but we do choose it as a collective. And I think like collectively, we might make better choices in the coming years. And I think collectively, we have made better choices at moments in our past. Like there were moments in our past where inequity was worse, I mean, in some ways than it is now. So when I'm not feeling despair, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the fact that there is a lot of cause for hope. Like there is real cause for hope if you look at the human story, and even if you look at the human present. Like injustice is very deep. It has a long history, but I don't think it's inevitable. Yeah, so that's where I feel hopeful. How close are we to the monetary goal for the Maternal Center of Excellence? Yeah, so that's part of why I didn't answer that question directly, is that I don't have a direct answer. So because it's both, there's two amounts of, you can imagine two amounts of money. There's like there's more than two ways of accounting this. There are several ways of accounting this, but if you imagine it as the money that we have like currently raised that's already in the bank, that is a pretty small percentage of what we need to raise. But if you include what has been pledged, like what people have promised that they will pay, that is much more. So like that is more than half to the $20 million we need to kind of officially start building stuff. And potentially, depending again on how you count it, like most of it. Like it's definitely more than half, but it's potentially like around 3/4. It depends on how much of the money that has been promised you assume will actually come in. Because like when people make pledges, ultimately like they aren't enforceable, you know, like you can't, or in some cases they are enforceable, but even so, there are ways to wiggle out of it. So like the way PIH has to account for it is done by their finance committee, and is complicated, and it's based both on what's in the bank and what's coming in, and what percentage of what's coming in we're sure is going to come in. Because the nightmare scenario, well, I mean, there's a lot of nightmare scenarios all around, but one of the nightmare scenarios here is you see in impoverished communities over and over and over again, people come in with the best of intentions, and they start something and then it proves complicated and difficult and it requires ongoing support. And there's that great Kurt Vonnegut line about how one of the flaws in the human character is that everyone wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. And so things fall apart. There are no, I mean, the one example of this that was shared with me by a driver, one of PIH's drivers, was that somebody donated an ambulance, but there's no way to get the particular axle to the front end. And so when the front axle broke, there was no way to ship in a new front axle, and they just couldn't get one. And so there's the ambulance not doing any ambulance stuff. So we don't want that. That's the thing that PIH, I think, has historically done a really good job of avoiding, of not contributing to that story. And so that's something that they protect against very carefully by making sure that you know, a large percentage of the money that's been pledged has to be in the bank before this can happen. Okay. John, are you reading anything that brings you peace or hope? I've been reading a lot about cholera and other infectious diseases. It has brought me hope in one sense, which is that, I mean, it's really discouraging to see people who are marginalized and impoverished and made vulnerable by these, I don't know how else to refer to them except for like oppressive systems of resource extraction, unfair distribution of resources, etc. To see the most marginalized people blamed the most. That was the case with cholera in New York in 1832, when the spread of the disease was blamed on immigrants and Black Americans. It's the case in London, where the cholera pandemic was blamed on immigrants and Black Londoners. Over and over again, it's the case. And with cholera now, cholera is truly an expression of our failure as a species to get serious about equal access to healthcare and universal access to healthcare, because nobody should be dying of cholera. And we shouldn't live in a world where cholera is an endemic problem anywhere. And yet we are. And the sixth, I think it's the sixth or seventh cholera pandemic is ongoing and has been since the 1960s and will be, not until we discover a cure or discover a treatment or discover a vaccine, all of which we have. It will be ongoing until we get serious about improving systems and making sure that they serve the needs of vulnerable people, regardless of whether those people can pay for the maintenance of those systems. Ending cholera would be in all of our best interests. It would be in the best interest of the human species to live in a world where this disease doesn't kill tens of thousands, or in some years, hundreds of thousands of people. It would, I mean, even if you're like the most libertarian, free market person in the world, like, it would be in the best interest of the economy not to lose all of this disability and death to a disease that is totally unnecessary. And so reading about the history of cholera when I say that it's been giving me hope, I don't mean that like it's been giving me hope because I see like, that the world is like full of like rainbows and kittens or whatever. It gives me hope in the sense that there was a time when we didn't, like, when we were worse at dealing with cholera than we are now. Much worse at dealing with it than we are now. And part of that problem was a pure lack of knowledge, but a lot of that problem was the same kind of, oppressive systems that we see today. when I look into the future, I have to believe that we will continue to get that we will hopefully accelerate the speed at which we get better. I have to believe that we're going to respond to this global crisis by understanding that the need for access to basic healthcare services is universal and global, and that none of us is well cared for unless all of us is well cared for. That nobody, that these diseases don't care about, they don't honor geographic boundaries. If we do not have universal access, and this includes in the United States, to basic high quality healthcare, we are always going to live in this deeply unjust world. And that's why I love PIH's slogan, or recent slogan, or tagline, or whatever. Like, Diet Dr. Pepper tastes more like regular Dr. Pepper. Well, the one that PIH has been using is "Injustice has a cure." And I really believe that. Like, I don't think that addressing healthcare inequity is going to solve injustice on its own. But I think healthcare inequity is one of the biggest expressions of injustice in our current world. And so I'm hopeful, because I see people doing work to make that better. And I see that it has gotten better. Now we are going to take steps back in the next year. And in fact, we were already kind of taking steps back even before this happened. So I think it's wrong to blame it all on COVID-19. The declines in poverty were slowing, the declines in child mortality were slowing, but all of that stuff is going to be much worse than I ever expected to see in my lifetime. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I just don't believe that. I believe that and maybe this is naive of me, or maybe it's a result of the ridiculous good luck that I've had throughout my life, but I really believe that hope is correct. So that's what brings me hope. Why were the declines in child poverty and mortality, child mortality slowing? A few reasons. One, so the optimistic version, I guess, from what I've read at least, is that, you have to remember that between 1990 and 2005, both global poverty and child mortality decreased faster than they had at any time in human history. So continuing that was always going to be hard, because you were going to get to the kind of the really complicated poverty. And you were going to get to these questions of on some level, global wealth is based on impoverishment. I mean, is that political? I don't know if that's overly political, but I think it's provably true. Anyway, so that was one thing. But then I think also there was a decline in the investment, especially in the growth of the investment in healthcare, in global healthcare, especially in impoverished communities. So I think that was a big reason. But it's complicated. These are big, complicated problems, and I don't want to distill it to one thing. But yeah. Okay. I think that I have to go, because I have therapy. You can probably tell that it's been 6 days and 23 hours since I last had therapy. But I really, really appreciate all of y'all being here, and being here to. I really appreciate you donating. Again, it means a lot to me. I know it means a lot to everybody in Sierra Leone. One of the nice things about listening to those audio updates is that you really do feel like, oh, my money is going to real people who are doing really hard work with an extraordinary level of commitment. And so, in some ways, these people are our colleagues in this work and in this effort. So I really, really encourage you to listen to those audio updates if you're interested. It just really deepens your connections, help you understand some of the challenges, like stuff that I would never think about because I don't understand supply chains well enough. But also helps you see some of the extraordinary commitment that people have to making the world a safer place for expectant mothers and for babies and for all of us. So here's to continuing to strengthen healthcare systems. And I'm really, really grateful to be here with y'all and grateful to have this talk, and look forward to talking with you again next month. And and if you have any questions, you can always, I can't promise that I'll respond because I get a lot of emails, and I apologize for the ones I don't respond to. I feel bad, but I also, it's just kind of practicality. But if you have questions or anything, you can always email me at sparksflyup@gmail.com. And PIH Sierra Leone is here. So just listen to them, really. If you could go to their YouTube channel. I mean, I don't want to say they just commented, but it's the best subscription on YouTube. I guess maybe the best subscription on YouTube is Kurt's Gazette, and then PIH Sierra Leone is my second favorite subscription on YouTube. So so check out their YouTube channel, and it's a really good way to kind of stay in touch and feel that connection that we need to feel. And thank you for continuing to support their efforts there to radically reduce maternal mortality. That job has not changed, and strengthening the system in Kono and beyond is still, regardless of what happens with COVID-19, is going to be central to that community's ability to face the pandemic, but also to face future healthcare shocks. So I really believe that investing in systems is more important now than it is ever, and that we see very clearly around the world what happens when systems aren't resilient enough, and we need to really work to strengthen the most fragile healthcare systems around the world and try very hard to do whatever we can to make sure that those systems can better serve the most vulnerable people who have the most need. So thank you for being part of that with us, and really, really grateful, and look forward to talking with you next month. All right, bye. I never know how to end the stream. This is the thing that I'm worst at.